Hi, this is Paul. This is my latest installment in my ongoing series, Words That Fudge. And this week's fudgy word is religion. Now, Jordan Peterson, a while ago, explained what he believed by religion, and this obviously came to be part of his ongoing conversation with Sam Harris and other atheists. So let's listen to this clip from Lafayette College.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. So I was watching a few of your interviews in preparation for this, and I heard you speak about religion quite a bit. And if you look up what religion means in the Webster Dictionary, you get something like a system of faith centered on a supernatural being or beings or something like that. Mm. But I've heard you use religion to describe things like punk rockers, for example, that's a religious experience. So my first question would be, how do you define what is considered religious? And then sort of as a follow-up to that, if, say, Sam Harris...
Religious is what you act out.
What's that?
Religious is what you act out.
Anything you act out.
Everything you act out is predicated on your implicit axioms. And the system of implicit axioms that you hold as primary is your religious belief system. It doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or not. That's just surface noise.
So it has nothing to do with divinity or
No,
supernatural
I didn't say
beings?
No.
Or it doesn't necessarily have to do with those?
No, it probably necessarily has to do with it too, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your voluntarily articulated statements about whether or not you believe in something like a transcendent deity. So, I mean, what you act out is much more what you are than what you say about yourself. And what the hell do you know about what you believe anyways? You're complicated, man.
It's a fair question.
Well, seriously, people are complicated. You know, like we're not transparent to ourselves at all. That's why we have to go to university and study psychology. It's like, you know, we're not exactly black boxes, but we are the most complicated things there are. Right? And we can't even program our VCR clocks. So it's like, how the hell can we propose to understand ourselves? And, you know, I'm existentially oriented, which is to say that I think that what you hold to be true is best determined as a consequence of an analysis of your actions rather than as a consequence of an analysis of what you purport to believe. Now, in order to act, you can't act without a hierarchy of value, which I tortured the other poor questioner about. You can't act without a hierarchy of values because you can't act unless you think one thing is better than another. Because why would you act otherwise? So that means that you're embedded within a hierarchy of values, whether you know it or not, or maybe multiple fragmentary and competing hierarchies of value, which is all the worse for you, by the way, because it just makes you very confused. That hierarchy of values has an axiomatic, it's based on axioms. And the probability that you understand them is very low because generally people don't understand their axioms. But that axiomatic system is essentially your religious system. And there's no way out of that as far as I can tell. And you can say, well, it isn't predicated on conscious belief in a transcendent deity. It's like, okay, have it your way. But, you know, most people in this room act out a Judeo-Christian ethic. And not only do they act it out, if they're treated in a manner that's not commensurate with that ethic, they get very, very, very annoyed. So, for example, if I fail to treat you as if you're an embodiment of a divine fragment, let's say, that's characterized by the ability to make free choice and to determine your own destiny in some sense, or if I fail to treat you as if you're a valued contributing member of the polity as a sovereign individual, then you'll find that very offensive and become angry. It's like, okay, then that's what you believe. Well, if I ask you if you believe any of that, well, that's a whole different story. You might give me some radical leftist nonsense. But that doesn't take away from what you've... that doesn't take away from the fundamentals of your action.
As one final thing, so when you and, say, Sam Harris argue about religion, you're arguing about fundamentally different things, it sounds like. His conception of what is religious is very different from yours.
Yeah, well, he tends to think of religious thought the same way that a smart 13-year-old atheist thinks about a fundamentalist Christian. It's like, yeah, okay, you're just not getting to the heart of the matter. You know, and I just finished reading all of Sam's books in the last couple of weeks. And as far as I'm concerned, he doesn't ever get to the bottom of the issue. He doesn't address the fundamental thinkers. There are some profound thinkers. Dostoevsky's one, Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Jung. It's like they're completely absent from, and the same with Dawkins. It's completely absent. All that conceptualization is completely absent from their corpus of works. They don't even have an understanding for the psychological utility of religion. And it's a big problem. You know, you don't get to be an atheist when the people you attack are like naive fundamentalists. And I have some sympathy for the naive fundamentalists. It's like what they're basically saying is something like this. Look, we have an ethos that's valuable. You scientist types are casually dismantling it. What the hell are we supposed to do? Well, the fundamentalists don't know what to do about that. So they say, well, creationism is science. It's like, well, no, it's not. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a point. Their point is there's something valuable here. It's like, don't break it casually. What are you going to replace it with? The new atheists wish that everybody becomes rational. It's like, yeah, sure, that's going to happen.
Thank you.
So right there, fudgy already. As the young man did, I'll just take the Google scrape here. Definition of religion in English. Noun, a belief and worship in a supernatural controlling power, especially a personal god or gods. This was exactly the definition that Peterson was pushing back on. Peterson said, you know, your axiomatic positions underneath, even below your conscious level, these are your acting out religion. And when I heard him say this, I thought, yeah, he and I are on the same page, because that's pretty much what I assume someone's religion is. But the actual usage of the English word is the atheists have a fair pushback. So there's two sub-definitions here. A particular system of faith and worship, yeah. A pursuit or interest in which someone ascribes something of supreme importance. And this gets into what Christians often talk about as idolatry. Now, if we look at the etymology of the word, in English, it comes from the Old French, which goes back to the Latin religare, which means to bind. Religio, obligation, bond, reverence. Middle English, originally in the sense of life under monastic vows. From the Old French, or from Latin religio, obligation, bond, reverence, perhaps based in Latin religare, to bind. The under monastic vows of Middle English. So religion in English, okay, and the English comes from the Latin and the Middle English, it has this idea of being bound. You're bound to something, and bound to vows, bound to a vocation, bound to a community, bound to a discipline. So right away, the question of the relationship between the word religion and, let's say, supernatural, again, as I've said in many videos, when you use that word supernatural, you're evoking an entire history of philosophical assumptions. Now, one of the interesting questions is, well, how about religion in the Bible? Well, actually, the word religion is hardly found in the Bible. You'll find it in some English translations, but usually only a few times. And there's three major passages in the New Testament where they're translating, the Greek threskia, which is really a word that has much more to do with rites and rituals and these types of things. So the first passage from Colossians 2. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or by regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. And now you're going to get a sense of Paul's idea of sacraments. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. In other words, there's a more solid thing that's casting a shadow into this world. The light via this solid thing is casting a shadow into this world, because there's always three elements that go into shadow making. There's the light source, there's the solid thing, and then there's the shadow that the solid thing casts against the background. There's a shadow of the things that are to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. And so, in other words, Paul says that these rituals, these rites, are a shadow of the things that were to come, and in a sense a pre-shadow. Kind of sometimes when I talk about eschatology, as I'll talk a little bit later, there's a actually I'm thinking about my sermon, a pre-echo. Do not let anyone delight in false humility, and the worship of angels disqualified you. Now that worship, they don't use religion there. It could very well, you could translate it the religion of angels, because the same word in the next two passages will be translated as religion. Now there's a lot of debate about whether they're worshiping angels in terms of the angels being the focus of the religion. Actually, my New Testament professor at Calvin Seminary had written an academic paper on this text, suggesting that actually the worship that angels do might have been a cult that some Jews in the Hellenistic world were potentially participating in. So do not let anyone delight in the false humility and the worship of angels, or the religion of angels. Actually, if you used religion, it would at least point the passage more towards Andy Banstra's assumption. Such a person also goes into a great deal about what they have seen. They are puffed up with idle notions by their unspiritual mind. And so it's things that they've seen. That's religious experience. I was talking yesterday to Skip Connor, who is Connor. Oh, I get his name right. Who has a Jungian reading group on the internet, and he'd been making some videos talking about myself and Jordan Peterson, and so we're having some more direct conversation about some of those things. But you'll notice that Paul, that the New Testament has a very complex understanding, which I think is rightfully so, of religious experience. It isn't to diminish it or downplay it, but it also doesn't just embrace it unquestioningly. So Colossians 2, the worship of angels, the religion of angels, the worship that angels do of God, or the types of worship. Now, some of these things come through clear here in the Acts 26. Paul is talking about his background. The Jewish people all know the way I have lived since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country and also here in Jerusalem. They know me for a long time, and they can testify, if they are willing, that I conform to the strictest sect of our religion. And this is a more common use of the word religion. It describes a particular community that has particular practices and beliefs, and that's a very fair use of the word religion. Living as a Pharisee. And then James 1. This is very interesting, because this gets into a much more sacramental view of it, similar to what's implied in the Colossians 2 text. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Now right here you see the fudginess of this word religion, because religion can be seen as meaning a community that is defined or created or set about by groups of beliefs, overt confessional beliefs or practices. Those are religious communities. But as James says, well, true religion is actually, then doing some of these things which are direct, caring for widows and orphans, let's say, acts of kindness. And so what James does is he connects these rites and rituals with the rest of life, and says that these things actually should be one seamless thing. And in a sense, James is getting more into that Petersonian definition of religion. And so James would say that acting out your beliefs gets expressed both in these rituals that one participates in, these overt beliefs that one expresses, and then these other actions which aren't necessarily easily or directly tied to those particular, what we would call religious beliefs, but they themselves are an expression of those beliefs. So you might say, well, because Jesus told me I need to love my enemies, then I will be kind and do acts of kindness for my enemies. Jesus says, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. So I'm going to do this for people, but I'm going to do it in a way that doesn't draw attention to myself. Now, I had a conversation with Ron Dart yesterday, or a couple of days ago, which will be coming out probably next week or the week after. Definitely the week after. Albeit when I'm on vacation, I try not to keep the channel totally empty. But I've started reading this book that Ron Dart talked about Erasmus and Luther. Of course, Ron Dart's very excited about Erasmus, being an Erasmus scholar. But this book about Erasmus and Luther and the fight for the Western mind. And right away, in the first paragraph of the book, I was interested. Towards the end of the year 1516, Erasmus of Rotterdam, then living in the Low Countries, received a letter from George Spalatin. And if you know any Luther history, Spalatin, bing, bing, bing. The secretary to Frederick the Wise of Saxony. After expressing his esteem for the Dutch humanists, Spalatin explained that he was writing on behalf of an Augustinian priest, that was Martin Luther, whom he didn't name. The priest had read Erasmus's recent publication. Erasmus was the first, in some ways, Erasmus was the first popular author, the first man to become wealthy by selling books after the development of the printing press. Michael Messing goes on to say that afterwards. He had read Erasmus's recently published annotation of the New Testament, notes on the Latin translation known as the Vulgate, and had two concerns. One related to original sin. Erasmus, the priest believed, had misunderstood Paul's position on this doctrine and had urged him to read Augustine's commentary on it, which he felt would set him right. He also objected to Erasmus's understanding of works. Now, when I read this completely caught my attention because I'm really trying to figure out what happened in the Protestant Reformation with respect to sacraments and sacramentalism. So what are works? Now, James had just said works are the feeding of widows and orphans. Is that what you mean by works? Or are works religious rites? Erasmus seemed to feel that Paul, in rejecting the performance of works, was referring to only to rites and ceremonies, when in fact he meant all kinds of works, including keeping the 10 Commandments. And so, in other words, what is the relationship between these religious things, which we would think about as going to church, listening to a sermon, participating in the Lord's Supper, being baptized, participating in the liturgy, all of these things, these rites and ceremonies that secular people look at as religious, and then these other things which secular people don't look at as religious. Let's say helping your neighbor out if they have a flat tire, or if their house was flooded, or if they're hungry, or helping a homeless man. You see, with our current conception of religious, and especially the definition of the secular, of the celebrity atheists, one side says, well, it's clear that going to church and taking the Eucharist and being baptized and participating in a liturgy and praying and reading the Bible, those are religious, but helping your neighbor out if he's in trouble or helping widows and orphans, that is not religious, that is secular. And if you've been following my channel, you know one of the things that I'm really working on is what is this question between the religious and the non-religious? And of course, Peterson jumps right in and says anything that's tied to your what religion is are these axioms beneath the surface that manifest themselves out in action. And in that sense, Jordan Peterson and the author of the book of James seem to be on the same page. Now, in talking to Skip yesterday, one of the things that caught my attention when I talked to him was he gave me Carl Jung's definition of religion, which I found fascinating because I was already working on this video. What are religions, says Jung? Religions are psychotherapeutic systems. Oh, that's interesting. It's also terribly modern and contemporary because we very quickly associate the religious with the therapeutic. And that's something that we're going to have to talk a lot more about. What are we doing, we psychotherapists? We are trying to heal the suffering of the human mind. of the human psyche, which itself is a very fraught word, or of the human soul. And the religions deal with the same problem. So Peterson and Jung are not that far from each other. Therefore, our Lord himself is a healer. He is a doctor. He heals the sick, and he deals with the troubles of the soul. And that is exactly what we call psychotherapy. Now, again, there's tons of stuff in there to unpack, which I'm not going to take the time to work on now. But it all gets into this question of the relationship between these axioms that are in our hearts and our manifest behavior, and these things that we label as religious. Now, Jung is going to broaden it here and says, well, that which relieves suffering. And so in Jung's definition, well, helping out, taking care of widows and orphans, helping out the homeless, that would be religious. But he also says, well, psychotherapy, so those who are suffering from basically mental distress, and see, what's interesting about us is that throughout much of human history, physical distress was so utterly common, it's like we never got around to dealing with mental distress until we had full stomachs and good locks on the doors. And now that we have full stomachs and good locks on the doors, now suddenly we're feeling mental distress. And again, that isn't to say that ancient people or troubled people don't have mental distress. They do, but it's just interesting the way these things work. And so then, obviously, in the 20th and 21st century, you get the focus on the therapeutic. And so Jung places religions in the area of the therapeutic in that quote. Now, just I saw on Tim Keller's I saw on Tim Keller's channel this little video from Heidegger, which is, well, I keep forgetting I have an audio only podcast that is a translation of this, and this is in a different language, so I'll just read the subtitles, and hopefully it won't disrupt you if you're actually listening to it in its original language, because when I listen to Spanish and someone's talking underneath it like on the news, I always find that annoying. But here we go. On religion, Heidegger.
Ich würde also sagen.
Okay, let's try that again. On religion.
Ich würde also sagen,
I would say that men,
dass auch Menschen, zum Beispiel
for example, communists,
wie die Kommunisten, eine Religion haben.
have a religion when they believe in science. Well, that's interesting.
Nämlich, sie glauben an die Wissenschaft. Sie glauben unbedingt.
They believe absolutely in modern science. He would say they have faith.
An die moderne Wissenschaft. Und diese
And this is absolutely faith.
unbedingte Glaube, das heißt das Vertrauen
That is the trust in the certainty of the results of science.
auf die Sicherheit der Ergebnisse der Wissenschaften ist ein Glaube,
Is a faith and is, in certain sense, something that emanates from people.
und ist in gewissem Sinne etwas, was über den einzelnen Menschen hinausgeht und ist also
And is therefore a religion.
eine Religion. Und ich würde sagen,
And I would say no one is without religion.
kein Mensch ist ohne Religion und jeder Mensch
And every person in a certain way transcends themselves.
ist in gewisser Weise über sich hinaus, das heißt
That is, they are displaced.
verrückt.
Now, I also saw in Adam's Twitter this week, actually today, I guess it was, since there's no evidence, is it illogical to believe in life on other planets? And when Adam tweeted that, I thought that's a terrific question, because it evokes the question of religion and faith. Because you have the question, do you believe in that aliens have visited Earth? Is there evidence? And a lot of people would say, well, I don't believe in any of those UFO sightings, but I believe that there is life on other planets. Well, we don't have any physical evidence that there's life on other planets, but many people believe it. Why do they believe it? Because they think it's probable, because there's life on this planet. And what that shows is basically what they do is that they sort of have their position here and they extend outwards in terms of their imagination and say, well, I believe there is. And so there you have faith. Is that a sort of religion? Now, that was a great question by Adam, and great use of Twitter. Now, in my own tradition, in the Reformed tradition, which is part of Christianity, we always had this saying, all of life is religious. And essentially what we're saying is agreeing with Jordan Peterson's initial comment that what we do in all of our life is we work out our religion, and not necessarily the religion that we say we believe, but the religion that is in our hearts. And in past videos, I've played Tim Keller basically making the same assertion. Now, the rites and ceremonies are intended to be sacramental to the rest of one's life. In other words, there's supposed to be an expression that a wholeness between the rites and ceremonies and what we do in the rest of our lives. Now, there's almost always a disjunction between them. We fail in living them out. We fail in bearing witness to them. But, essentially, and I was working on the book of Ezekiel in my adult Sunday school class, what is true or wrong in the temple is manifest in the streets. That was part of what the point Ezekiel was making when he had these visions of the temple and these goings on in the temple. What's true in the temple will get manifest in the street. And that's connected with what's Jordan Peterson says, what's your axioms in the heart are what get manifest out into the rest of your life. And at some point, if I ever have a longish conversation with Jordan Peterson, this is probably what I'm going to talk about, because the idea of, well, why do Christians go to church? Why do Christians participate in these rites and rituals in what's technically called cultic activities, worship, prayer, all of reading the Bible, devotions, all of this is in order, an attempt to actually work out and express a far longer tradition. It's very aspirational, actually, a far longer tradition in the nuts and bolts of our lives. And as I say, Christians always fail at doing this, but this is what we're always working on. And faith is how you live in that way in a world of uncertainty. Do I know whether or not there are aliens? Aliens have visited the earth. There's a lot of people who say they have evidence. Do we have definite evidence? Yet many people will say, I believe that there are life on other planets. Well, there you have the question. In fact, a very conservative member of my church came in with a science magazine recently and showed all of these planets that they are discovering and said to me, and this really surprised me when he said it, he said, makes me think that there are people in these other worlds. And I thought, wow, I'm really kind of surprised hearing that come out of his mouth. But this is, in a sense, how faith works. It radiates outward, and then you have the question of, well, will I live in conjunction with that faith? And again, if you go back to the Jordan Peterson, David Nasser, one more question, this is the point that Nasser was making. So what I usually do when I talk to people or when I listen to people is I try to figure out what their real religion is. Now, what do I mean by that? And similar to Jordan Peterson, well, people will talk, but the talk is helpful, but it's in some ways not that helpful. So then I'll ask people often what they do. So and so and so. Do you do this? Well, why or why not? Because the doing gives you an idea of what's really going on inside their heart, which may be disconnected from what's going on in terms of their language. And so even when I'm just listening to people talking, I'm always trying to figure out what is their real religion. And that comes down to a few questions. Usually I get them talking, and if you watch my conversation videos, you probably begin to see a pattern that I get them talking, and I do a lot of listening. Ask them open-ended questions and see where they go with it. One of the interesting things is that the most common question Jesus gets asked or the most common question Jesus asks people are, what do you want? Because wanting is a big deal. Augustine, we are wanting creatures. We are defined by our desires, and in fact, our lives are hierarchically ordered desires. Jordan Peterson, the world is a form for action, and within this form for action, we exhibit what we want, and what we want gets played out in terms of the priorities that we have in directing our lives. Augustine and everything in the Augustinian tradition is all about ordered loves. What do we love most? Then there's someone at the door. Hang on. And I wouldn't separate, the story verse from the bio verse here either, because a biologist, look at biologists, what are they looking at? Well, what do these animals want? Well, animals want to eat, animals want dominance, animals want to procreate, so on and so forth. In fact, wanting, desiring is what makes the world go round. So where to start? Well, I usually start with two questions. What is your problem? And what is your solution? Or you can pull it back a little bit. What do you think is the root of the problem in the world? What do you think is the ultimate solution to the world's problems, if any can be found? And again, you see this with Peterson. What is your problem? Problems stack up with hierarchies in time and context. We see opportunities and threats. Our existential problem is discerned by the hierarchy. You have suffering, loss, decay. Now, in an actual age framework, you have the bottom story, which is, what is our problem? That's on the bottom. Then what is the solution? That's on the top. Heaven, earth, eternity, decay. And as I mentioned in my last video about the Peter Boghossian podcast, secular people, they don't have the two stories. Now, somebody made a comment about two stories in terms of a two-story house. I do mean it that way. It's also kind of two stories because there are two types of stories that are running. So in the axial age, you have heaven and earth, and the story of the Bible is a reconciliation of the story of heaven and earth. In secularism, you have now and the future. And so again, if you listen to secular people, well, we suffer from cancer now, but we will cure cancer in the future. And this is called progress. We suffer from war now, but we will resolve war in the future. We suffer from environmental degradation now, but we will resolve our environmental problems in the future, maybe or maybe not. And so what I do with this is I begin to look at what I see as the religion of the person. What do they think the problem is now? Well, the problem is self-centeredness, or the problem is greed, or individuals are, Rousseauian, individuals are pure, but institutions are evil, and, on and on and on. And so I ask questions to try and discern what is the problem, what is the solution. So what are the solutions? And you can look at Vervaeke's affordance conversation there, and there's a connection between us and what we're grasping at. Your salience landscape is shaped by the solutions you imagine, or at least to begin to try out. You're looking for relief from suffering, or relief from loss, or relief from decay. Again, this is the top story in an axial framework. This is heaven. The solution is, so then if you look at some groups of Christians, the solution is going to heaven when you die, or the happy hunting ground, or whatever second story axial framework you have, getting up to the good place. In a secular where you only have one level, the future, the good is hopefully the future, although the future isn't secure. And that's where you begin to tease out aspects of their religion. Well, things are bad now. Hopefully in the future they'll be good. But as with many secular stories, the future could be bad. And so then you have the pessimism get expressed in zombie movies and so on and so forth. Now this is a conversation that Peterson participated in a little while ago, Philosophy and the Human Soul. And I just remembered this as the objectivist, the Ayn Rand Institute conversation. And I had forgotten that was in fact the title of it. And what's interesting, as actually Dave Rubin points out, coming into this conversation, you've got the human soul right there, but already you're going to have difficulty of definition in terms of if anybody believes that human beings do have a soul. And I think in some ways
Let's shift a little bit, because I know we can talk.
This was one of the better conversations, and this really set up. Let's see, the date of this was July 9, so this was really setting up the Jordan Peterson Sam Harris conversations. So let's let this play.
Talk about inequality and the individual and all that. We can do that all night long. But the title of this talk is Philosophy and the Human Soul. So we only talked for literally about 20 seconds, the four of us, before, we didn't plan anything about what we were going to do here. So I thought the best way to start that would be, how would you even define the soul? Yaron, I'll start with you.
Really?
Yeah.
You got a psychologist, a philosopher, and a finance guy.
But this is for doing good at my job, man. We are.
And the rumor is that finance guys have no soul.
I was actually going to start with Jordan, but you looked down for a second, which was the cue that I should go right to you. Yeah.
I don't have a succinct, clear definition of it, but it has to do with consciousness and values. It has to do.
Now, again, and as I get later in this, different worldviews. I talked again about Paul Maxwell's lovely little 30-minute introduction to the whole history of philosophy and Western civilization. You have metaphysics, you have epistemology, and you have axiology. Down here with metaphysics, the limitations built into your metaphysical system that you both assume, presume, and assert, whether or not all those three are actually in alignment with each other, those limitations will limit what you're able to build in terms of your epistemology and your axiology. All right? So here, suddenly, when you have this word soul is problematic in a materialist or a physicalist framework. What do you mean by soul? And I think actually if you understand it as story, well, okay, if you listen to Vervaeke's, throw away materialism to at least talk about physicalism and at least include information. And again, I heard that from Daniel Dennett, and I think an unbelievable podcast. And when he said, well, there's matter plus information, I thought, oh, now we're cheating here, boys. Now we're adding information. Now well, what exactly is this information? And now we're letting in all kinds of stuff, because information is not physical. And if we're saying that information is not simply a human thing that we put on top or project onto the physical layer, but is itself a function of it, well, now we have far more. So if you're a physicalist, you have far more to deal with, but you're also open, I think, and liable to a lot of other questions about, well, where does this information come from? Because generally speaking, information is a function of mind. And so right away they're noticing that if your metaphysic doesn't include mind, you're going to get into trouble. And so now when we hear them talking about a soul, well, suddenly consciousness is in the room. And you're going to have to include consciousness, but you're including consciousness as one of the elements you start with. And that is problematic if you imagine that mind is simply a function of a material brain. If you're including consciousness from the beginning, I saw a very interesting, I should pull it up, hang on. So my friend Strawn sent me this, and again, one of these days I'll get Strawn on my channel. I really want to get him on my channel. But something or nothing he sends me, and it's a question, something or nothing, and Rupert Sheldrake's on this, and I'll see if I can find the clip. Now this whole video is worth watching, but I'm just going to play a little bit of it.
Very good, thank you. Rupert.
Well, when I was thinking about this discussion, I read Lawrence Krauss's book, Something from Nothing, because that's the most popular version of this debate from the cosmological point of view at the moment. And what struck me about it, and what struck me about most arguments, is how conservative they are. If you look at traditional discussions of why there's something rather than nothing, the traditional ones are theological discussions, they start from the assumption that there's a source of all things which is threefold. In Kashmiri Shaivism, it's called Parashiva, the unified source of all things, with Shiva, which represents the principle of form or order, and Shakti, which represents the principle of energy or power. In the Christian version of the Holy Trinity, you have God, the ground of all being. You have the Logos, which is the mind of God, the form, the source of all forms, and you have the Spirit, which is the source of energy, movement, and power. Well, in Lawrence Krauss, you have a source which he doesn't discuss, but it has two manifestations. One, the laws of nature, which may be the field of all possible laws of nature that may apply to all universes, but that's taken for granted as pre-existing. And then you have the quantum vacuum, which is the source of all potential energy and power for this and all other universes. In other words, it's exactly like Shakti, and his role of the laws of nature is exactly like Shiva, or the Logos and the Spirit. So this seemingly radical atheistic view is extraordinarily conservative in philosophical and theological terms. It just rephrases them, and with a few kind of polemical jabs against sort of old-fashioned theologians, he's basically restated the ancient case for the existence of God. He goes even further. He says that it's the nature of the quantum vacuum is so unstable that it almost inevitably would give rise to a universe through a kind of fluctuation. So, okay, let's look at Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. The earth was without form, the world was without form and void, and the Spirit of God moved on the face of the deep, or the face of the waters. Well, the quantum vacuum's pretty well a modern version of the face of the deep. And if the Spirit of God, the wind, moves on the face of the deep, it creates waves. And the waves presumably follow a law-like structure. So what struck me about all this was that the debate is essentially a theological debate that's been reframed in these modern physical terms. And the really interesting question for me about it is that in the theological debate, the ground of all this is conscious. Whereas for Lawrence Krauss, a materialist and atheist, the ground of all this is unconscious. Now, it's a matter of faith either way, I suppose. But as far as I can see, the advantage of the ultimate ground of being conscious has, first of all, there's a basis for these rational laws, instead of the laws of nature being free-floating mathematical abstractions that are outside space and time, that apply to all possible universes, that are ultimately metaphysical in the ultimate sense of metaphysics as being beyond physics. You've got free-floating laws which have no ontological basis whatever. And then you have human minds that appear mysteriously in an unconscious universe and can actually understand these laws, although we've evolved by evolutionary psychology of sort of using stone tools and primitive campfire-type techniques. Our minds are somehow able to comprehend the entire universe, so that there can be someone like Krauss putting forward theories about the ultimate nature of reality. Well, if there's a conscious basis for both reality and for human minds, the traditional view, this makes a lot more sense. Take that away, and we're left with a kind of unconscious version of traditional theology and a lack of explanation for the existence of minds of any kind, including those of physicists, which in philosophy of mind is called the hard problem.
And then, of course, they'll have Adam. But it's a great little teaser, and you can watch the whole thing. I'll put the link in the comments. So let's get back to this again, when Vervaeke moved from and said, well, materialism, no, physicalism, and I thought, now we're really going to have an interesting conversation, because once you have information, well, where does this information come from? Well, this information, these laws of physics have always been here. Oh, you mean they're eternal? Do they come from matter, or does matter work out in so many patterns? Well, we have infinite number of universes, and so then we're just in the one that works, and there's all these other universes where things don't work and bodies don't work, or there's not even enough works to make bodies or minds, or so on and so forth. So again, it's just getting very interesting. Okay, so then back to the soul. Well, what on earth is the soul, if we're going to talk about that?
With our conscious experiences, the sum of our conscious experiences, our being, and the values that we have as individuals, the things that are most important to us. And that, I think, experience is what I would refer as our soul or our spirit.
And now the difficulty you always have with consciousness is if we're having consciousness in a moment or ongoing consciousness throughout time. And then the question is, well, what can actually link consciousness throughout time? Well, very quickly, it's this autobiographical narrative that we construct, which, if you again watch the Vervaeke video I played in the last video, well, this is something that we develop and we grow and learn how to employ. But this then becomes our reality. This then becomes the reality in which we live. It becomes the story in which we live. And so, this is where we get the question of, well, what are we? Well, we are stories.
I think these are somewhat interchangeable. When I talk about spiritual experiences, it's an experience of consciousness. It's if you listen to a piece of music and the combination of emotion, values, and your conscious listening and absorbing, that to me is what spirit, soul would mean.
See, and his idea of spirit, because generally speaking, spirit is that which moves, all right? So you see the trees moving, well, spirit, wind, that's what's moving the trees. Soul can't be both the thing that's being moved by spirit and spirit itself. So, again, he's really got a problem with, he just doesn't have enough pieces to work with here. And so when asked a pretty fundamental question, well, what is soul? You're easier saying there is no such thing as the soul, which is often an answer that you'll get from non-theists. There is no such thing as a soul. Oh, so what is this consciousness? And we still use the word. We still talk about the word. We can't give up the word, because so this hole in our language, hole in our conversation would be way too awkward. And so we're going to keep using this word, but we have to try and figure out how we can use this word in this context without having its absence be too noticeable.
Greg? Yeah, I would say, speaking as a philosopher and first as a Rand scholar.
So the philosopher, the finance guy struggles. So now the philosopher is going to take a whack at it.
She had the phrase that man is a being of self-made soul. So the idea here is your soul.
Man is a being of self-made soul. It's true in a sense, but we have problems with God being self-made. A lot bigger problems with us being self-made.
Soul is your consciousness. As the faculty, your ability to know and to think.
Your soul is your ability to think and to know? That's your soul?
But also, you have to build who you are, build your character, build your personality.
So soul is who you are. And again, that's quite a bit closer to the regular definition of what a soul is.
Build your values, come to value things, set your life around them. By doing that over time and pursuing them, you develop.
So again, consciousness over time, this story that you're constructing.
Develop a character, you develop into a certain type of person, you develop into a distinct individual. And there's a beautiful line in the Fountainhead, which this is the theme of this conference. Someone talks about how most people long for immortality, but when you meet them the next time, they weren't the same as they were the last. They're mutable, they're constantly changing, what they're after is constantly changing. But the hero of the novel, his friend says, you could imagine him existing forever. He's achieved immortality in his day-to-day life because there's a constancy to him. And that kind of constancy, that having a soul, having an I, being a particular person, it's an achievement. It's the achievement of having formed values, having formed something you want out of your life, and then having built for yourself through living this way a character that's adapted to that, a character that's focused on that.
This reminds me of Groundhog Day in a way, because in the Q&As that we've been doing for the last couple months, a couple times it's come up, what's your favorite comedy? And you've mentioned Groundhog Day, where Bill Murray has to consistently come back and do it better and do it better and do it better and do it better.
Well, what exactly is that thing that you're improving?
Now I've set you up.
And how do you navigate and evaluate and guide? What are the stars by which you use to guide the development of that? And how do we know that the thing is actually developing in a coherent way that can become something that you might dare to use the word eternal to refer to?
What is your definition of the soul?
Well, I was thinking that the words, the hand that writes and then moves on, came into my mind. And then I was thinking, well, this is the way I conceptualize how consciousness works. And so maybe this is, in some sense, the locale of the soul. So I don't believe that we're driven deterministically, like obviously we are to some degree, but I don't think that that's the right way of conceptualizing how human consciousness works. I think it's putting the cart before the horse in some sense. So the way it looks to me is that what we have arrayed in front of us is a landscape of possibility. And I think that that's phenomenologically accurate. You know, when you wake up in the morning, especially when you wake up at 3 in the morning, and you're concerned about how your life is going, you see an array of possible futures manifest themselves in front of you. And you know, there are more possible futures, of course, than you can imagine, but there's plenty that make themselves manifest. I could do this, I could do that, this could happen, what about this, maybe I should do this. And it's like there's a branching landscape in front of you, and some of the places that you're headed to are more likely than others, and some of them take a lot more effort to attain than others, but it's a distribution of possible landscapes. And that's actually your reality. It's not like you're driven deterministically by the present. You see a branching landscape of possibility in front of you, and I think of that as potential. And we all know about potential because we upbraid ourselves and each other for not living up to our potential, which is a very interesting thing that we do, because potential isn't something concrete. And in fact, it's the opposite of concrete, and yet we act as if it's the most real thing. You should live up to your potential, you know, and your conscience will bother you if you don't live up to your potential. So you have a potential, and there's a potential that manifests itself. And then what you seem to do is that you make choices between those alternate realities, and you do that in part by imposing a value structure on them and deriving a pathway as a consequence of that. But you decide which of those potentials are going to manifest themselves in actuality. And so you are the hand that writes that and then moves on. And this is a very deep idea. I mean, I've traced it back to I think, our most profound religious intuitions. The idea that it was the word of God, for example, that gave rise to habitable order out of chaos at the beginning of time, I think is a reflection of the same idea. I think the soul is the thing that mediates between potential and actuality. And I mean that literally and metaphorically at the same time. That's what you're doing, is you're confronting potential, which is that which could be, and you're deciding which of that is going to be. And the thing that's doing that is the soul. And that's its divine task. And I think...
Now, divine, okay, what do you mean by that word? And I think what, in a Petersonian content, that which is at the top of the hierarchy. That is the ultimate task. That is the most important task. And that is the task of tasks.
The fact that you do that is actually why it's necessary for societies to grant you the idea of intrinsic right. That's why it's necessary for functional societies to be predicated on the idea that you have intrinsic value, is because you actually are the locale where potential transforms itself into actuality. And so we determine the action of our soul determines the actuality of the world. I think that's genuinely the case.
So this is really interesting to me, because I'm watching you guys and I can see a lot of agreement, but obviously Jordan made at least 2 references to God and religion there. Now, obviously this is where an objectivist and Jordan would have a point of disagreement. This is why you're doing these public events with Sam Harris. And one of the things that I've been thinking about it as we've been on tour is, at the end of the day, if we all ultimately agree, and if everyone in this room, if we could ultimately agree on a morality and the definition of a soul that all made sense, and Jordan's perhaps had a more religious connotation and yours didn't, and we all could live functioning good lives within that, then does it really matter beyond the interest in the intellectual discussion? Because there was a lot of agreement. I could see it in your body language, in both of you guys. Greg, I'll start with you.
Well, let me start with some of the things I agree with a lot, and including some of the use of religious language. I think there's a good reason for, even for those of us who aren't religious or don't think of ourselves as, and I think of myself as an atheist. I am an atheist. But, though I know you interpret that word differently. But
he'll tell you if you're an atheist or not.
We'll get into an argument about this later. But, so first of all, I think what we see in what you're describing about the many manifold potentials and the soul actualizes it is a conviction which I very much agree with, and I think we can know is true, and I think I agree we presuppose in all of our thinking and all of our judging of people, which is that we have free will, that there's not a future that's written and we're just on a path traveling down it, but rather in every moment we're able to make choices, and our choices change the future. And that is a really profound fact. It's a profound fact about our consciousness. It's connected to everything else that's of value about us. And I agree, if that wasn't true of us, we'd be a very different kind of creature. We wouldn't interact with each other in the same way, and we wouldn't need the same kind of political structure. And it's such a profound fact about us that we don't really have language for it, or very good language for it. Religion.
What's interesting is that we don't really have very good language for it. Well, he just said, well, the language we have for it is religious. He's an atheist, so it's like, well, we've been trying to leave that language behind, and we haven't come up with a replacement. Well, why? Well, maybe because the language you're trying to leave behind is, in fact, the language, as Peterson has made a point over, that has been developed over very long periods of time and is already the best tool you have, but you want to avoid it. Why?
Has been the form in which people have thought about the most profound facts, about their most profound experience, language fact about us, that we don't really have language for it, or very good language for it. Religion has been the form in which people have thought about the most profound facts, about their most profound experiences, about their understandings of them from as long as there's been people, or as long as there's been, anyway, for a very, very long time. And as we've lost religion, we haven't...
That's so alarmingly passive. It's as if it's the bucket and pail I left on the beach as we lost religion. We haven't been losing it. We've been throwing it away.
Found ways of and as we've lost religion, we haven't found ways, or haven't always found ways, to conceptualize independently of religion those kind of profound values.
That's because fairy tales are hard to write.
The profound role of freedom in human life, what our highest potential is. And so if you're going to talk...
All right there. This whole scheme of the video, you just laid it out right there. All of this stuff, that's our religion. And apart from religious language, we haven't found language to conceptualize. And so this is why, well, why do I pay attention? What do I listen for? Why do I try to figure out, even with unreligious people, what their religion is? Because we all have the need for these aspects of conception. Now, certain groups of people are trying to frame it without religious language, but they're clearly struggling because they're avoiding this entire thing and not wanting to participate in it. And Rupert Sheldrake's observation that, well, they're really just saying, in many ways, they're sort of saying what various religious traditions have said. They're just avoiding religious language. And it's like, okay, why are you doing that? Why not just, why not untie the arm you've tied behind your back and participate in the conversation?
Talk about those kind of profound values, the profound role of freedom in human life, what our highest potential is. And so if you're going to talk about those things, it's very hard to do it without really reaching for at least religious metaphor.
See, that's a really crucial issue, I think. I think it's a fundamentally crucial issue.
But I want to say, though, because just to finish the disagreement part, what's true matters, right? And something can be a beautiful metaphor, but if understood literally is false.
Now we're getting into the Brett Weinstein, Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson conversation about metaphorical truth. And Alistair McGrath, just to put in an unpaid plug for Unbelievable, with Alistair McGrath talking to Brett Weinstein, I am really looking forward to that conversation. I really hope Alistair McGrath does his homework. He's a brilliant scientist and theologian.
And one of the things I think we need to do to lead our lives well, to achieve these kinds of values, is to really value our minds and value our reason and value getting at the truth. So
now, again, if you go back to the video I played last time about truth and taking Vervaeke's thing, there's this family of truth in a sense, where you have propositional truth, you have perspectival truth, you have power, you have, these four things that I laid out. All of this, what we've tended to do is, we limit it to propositional truth, and then we realize how in trouble we are because we don't have room for minds or anything else in the universe. The universe is just this blank space of objects, nothing else. And it simply doesn't work, and it's part of the reason we're coming to the end of it.
If it turns out that to lead our lives well, to achieve these kinds of values, is to really value our minds and value our reason and value getting at the truth. So
it's funny, we have to value our minds, but we're skeptical about what mind is.
It turns out that something's false, then believing that it's true is not going to make our lives better. And so I don't think it could turn out that we're going to have a very deep disagreement about what's true about the basic facts of reality, and yet we're all going to be hunky.
Again, the basic facts, he's framing it once again in terms of propositional truth.
On every agreement. And so I don't think it could turn out that we're going to have a very deep disagreement about what's true about the basic facts of reality, and yet we're all going to be hunky-dory on everything else. I think those disagreements will make a difference. But we have to acknowledge the role of consciousness and freedom in life, and I think there is an agreement between us on that.
What I've observed is, for example, in my clinical practice, when I'm talking about life and death moral issues, and these are in situations where extreme things are happening in families and in individuals' lives, talking about events that might have produced post-traumatic stress disorder or that set people up for murder at times, or suicide.
And when he says set people up for murder, meaning set people up to, they're ready to kill someone else, and maybe they have.
Or terrible, or that set people up for murder at times, or suicide, or terrible suffering, some of which is induced voluntarily. The probability that I can have a discussion with my clients about that at a level that will be salutary without using religious/metaphorical language is zero. If the discussion can't take place in the domain of good versus evil, something like that, and this is especially true, I would say, for post-traumatic stress disorder, you just don't get anywhere with it. And I've been thinking about the narrative issue a lot, constantly, and I think that...
Now, the narrative issue will become front and center at the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris talks. Now the question of why, and Sam Harris keeps finding narrative as this disturbing... narratives are just the illustrations that punctuate the propositional, factual conversation, which is the truthy stuff, and the narrative is just embellishment of it. And Peterson and Vervaeke see that as fundamentally wrong. Narrative, in fact, is the way we process this stuff. It's the only way we really can process this stuff.
We need to do a lot constantly, and I think that we need to use. This is one of the weaknesses of the rationalist argument, I think, is that we have to use heuristics to operate in the world. So heuristics are simplifying maneuvers. And there's no option. You have to use heuristics. And the reason for that is because there is a lot more world than there is of you. And so you take this incredibly complex reality and you simplify it. And now the simplifications have to have merit. And what makes them have merit is grounds for is a topic for a very lengthy discussion. But to produce those simplifications, you have to use heuristics. You have to use cognitive shortcuts. And it looks to me like narrative is a heuristic, and that the reason that we need to tell stories and that we probably need to have our ethic grounded in stories is because you can't make a list of rules that will tell you how to live. Rules don't suffice, but you can tell stories that lay out broad principles, and those are heuristic principles. Now, but the thing is that the most fundamental stories seem to have a religious core. Now, I'm not exactly sure why that is, although I think it probably has to do with something I referred to earlier, which is the idea that, you know, you are, as a soul, you're the thing that transforms potential into actuality. That seems to be the grounding concept in some sense. So
now, it's helpful to notice that the soul is the actor, is the agent in the story, that the soul actually is a function of this storyverse, of this whole heuristic, which is, again, I think Peterson is right, the best and the principal way, the primary way we actually manage to make sense of this far too complex world for small-brained, short-lived creatures to actually live with. And this is exactly where you get God number one in the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris talk at the end of the Vancouver One talk.
That's the grounding concept. There's something divine about that. Out of that arises a sequence of stories that are shaped across perhaps evolutionary history, and inside that our more articulated ethic exists. And I don't see a way out of that, because you cannot make an exhaustive list of rules that enable ethical movement forward, and you need to do that if you had a purely rational view of the way that human cognition functions. It's something like that.
Okay. This again lays us right into the Ian McGilchrist territory, where you have the conceptualization of the mind of the right and left hemispheres. The right hemisphere, you know, whether that's literal or metaphorically structured, the right hemisphere being unknown territory and the left being mapped territory. Now, there's always, by definition, more unknown territory and unmapped territory than territory. And the reason, because we only live this long and our minds are only this big, and even of the amount of possible experiences we have between birth and death, or conception and death, even of that which we are physically present for receiving, even that we have to compress way down. And you can even think about compression algorithms for pictures. Even that you have to compress way down into this tiny little thing to get through this straw of consciousness. So there's always more unknown than mapped territory. And so the left brain mapping, which are rational reductions, and the way reason works is reason is kind of a coherence framework where we're checking. Does this cohere? Does this relate? Does this connect up? Are these things, like if you have two lists, you're checking, are the sums the same? You're just going through it. That's what reason does. Reason tries to correlate things, and so it looks at evidence. Does this seem right? And does this check out? So you have these rational reductions, but even the rational reductions themselves are heuristics. This is the point Peterson keeps making. You have to take a sample, a reduced sample, but just as, let's say, if you had, you know this if you pay attention to photography, let's say you take this picture and Google, I use Android phone, Google uploads a compressed version of the picture I took. And so I'll keep the original picture I took, but even that original picture I took had a certain amount of resolution. The compression, and they call it lossy compression, it takes that and it makes it into a smaller thing. Well, how do you do that? You have to leave some things out of the compressed version so that it fits. Now, we're always doing this, and the reason you can tell you're always doing this is show somebody a picture, take it away, and ask them what they saw. Their salience will have them fix on certain things. Now, if it's a very complicated picture, you can begin to ask them questions about other things that perhaps are not in the picture, and they won't know anything about this. Peterson illustrates that with the gorilla video, where the people are passing the basketball, and you have to count how many times they pass the basketball, and a guy in a monkey suit comes into the middle, beats his chest and goes out, and I didn't see the dude at all. Why? I'm paying so much attention. So it's that salience, it's that realization. And so this is what happens. And well, one of the heuristics, we don't have the algorithm that takes a 24 megapixel picture and turns it into a file that's less than a megabyte large. We don't have that. We have this other algorithm in our head, and salience gets in there, and so we pick and choose what's salient to us, and that's what we remember of the picture. And so our minds are always doing this. And McGilchrist says, why are these two hemispheric brains so common in the world? Well, we've got one that's dealing with the big picture and the other that's dealing with the compressed algorithm. And Ian McGilchrist says, we get into trouble when we think that the compressed algorithm is the totality of the picture. Now, one might arguably say, well, isn't that the problem of religion? Yes, it certainly is. But it's a function of the human problem. All right? You might say, well, I'm going to get rid of religion to get rid of that problem. You won't get rid of the problem. The problem is that you are limited, that you cannot take it all in. You just can't process that way because of what you are. So narrative is our best organizing psychotechnology. That is our compression algorithm. And it does a number of things at once. It both selects what we pay attention to, and it gives you basically something to give you a coherent, take the snapshots. If you've ever seen that movie Memento, which is a great movie, well, he can't put his pictures together, so he keeps working from these snapshots, and you have all of these different storylines going. He just keeps making up new storylines because he can't put the pictures together. Well, narrative puts the pictures together and gives us a coherent story. You might say, but that story leaves all kinds of things out. Yes, we can't have it any other way. On one hand, we look at consciousness and we say, wow, what an amazing gift of consciousness. I wouldn't want to live without it. On the other hand, it's a tremendously limiting thing that we have. So we have become stories. By it, we become persons, actors in the story. And by it, we are agents in the world. Okay? But vast stories have tokens. And you'll notice this if you're a couple. You have special songs. Families have special stories, special mementos, and as a pastor, you're regularly with people when, someone dies, they're breaking up the house. And what happens is you sift through everything in the house, and you can't keep everything in the house, so you take this memento, you take this photograph, you take this letter. Now, what happens sometimes is kids are like, I want to keep the whole thing. And what I do is you say, okay. And then you wait. Because, now they're paying, to keep an empty house because they want the shrine to the life that they have lost when their parent has died. And at some point they come to the realization, I need to go into the house and take some things that are special, and the rest of it will have an estate sale. And everybody else is going to come in with their salience landscape and pick the house apart until it is no more. And there we have loss. Remember my two questions. What is the problem? What is the answer? So you have these mementos. You have these vast stories, and they all come down into certain things. Couples have these. Families have these. Friends groups have these. So then you have sacred songs and sacred places and items that represent and embody the whole. And in Christianity, you have this meal. And in one hand, it's very, very simple. Bread and wine. And it's not even always bread. And it's not even always wine. It gets down into this tiny, tiny thing, which has been, back to the Protestant Reformation thing, this thing that's been fought about over because it's the thing right at the center. And if you look at the cross, Jordan Peterson's observation, heaven and earth, right there at the center, that's where this meal is too. All of those things come together. Sacraments of the relationship. And that's so if your parent has died and you go into the house and boom, your mind captures something and you say, there it is. This is the sacrament of the family. This is where the story verse and the matter verse come together. The story verse becomes physical. The timeless enters time. The logos becomes flesh. Now, tokens, they begin there, but they get remembered. Do this in remembrance of me. Now here's a picture of, this picture was probably taken before I was born. This is my father, young Stan Vanderklay, right out of seminary. It's in the 60s. He's still wearing his clergy, they're not his vestments necessarily, but his clergy uniform. He's wearing his black suit and his clerical collar. In the 70s, he put away some of those things, and they didn't really come back. Now they're coming back into fashion, but he's standing there with Mrs. Vogel, who was a dear saint, and a whole bunch of children from the community that they're helping. And they're remembering the story. And so what happens is that the sacrament, the gift, this sacrament of Jesus' crucifixion, the wine which represents the blood, and the body which represents the bread, and the body represents, whoosh, the bread and the wine represent, I can't, they represent Christ's giving. And so when Dad goes into the neighborhood with Mrs. Vogel and they've got this old bus, they give to the children of the neighborhood. Now, Erasmus versus Luther on rights versus moral actions of the world. There it is. It's all right there. How can we talk about this? Jordan Peterson as the soul, as the actor in the space of consciousness. Yes, but it comes down to these tokens that get remembered into then new stories. So the story of Stan Vanderklay and Angie Vogel as they're ministering to the children of the First Ward of Paterson, New Jersey, it's the body and the blood getting remembered into what would become Northside Chapel in Paterson, New Jersey, which would be the place that I grew up in. So you have this process of back and forth in history weaves us into this far more cohesive story. And so now you can begin to see the power of story in the midst of this, because now I am an agent, because of story, in this world around. And that is a far richer and more accurate telling than I am one object in the midst of other objects. Well, that's just sort of flat on a portrait. Now, how do these stories cohere, and where do dead ends develop? Well, one of the best books I've read in the last 20 years is this little book by Alistair McGrath entitled Heresy. And again, Alistair McGrath is going to be talking to Brett Weinstein. I am looking so forward to that conversation. But a couple of quotes, because this word heresy is kind of floating out there. Well, heresies are elements that create narrative dead zones. All right, we are not required to accept prepackaged worldviews, but are able to create ones that resonate with our own perception of how things ought to be. So we all have these ideas. I think the world should be this way. I think the world should be that way. Well, there is a world out there, and so we try out our ideas with language, and we try out our ideas with action, and we see if what we're saying and what we're doing actually cohere to the story, which is both the story and the material world all together. All right? And heresy as well, we come in and we try something new. Well, here's the question. Will it be fruitful in the story? Will it finally yield to more story? Will it yield to what we might call flourishing? So what is heresy? Heresy is best seen as a form of, now he's speaking within a Christian framework, heresy is best seen as a form of Christian belief, so heresies are Christian, that more by accident than design ultimately ends up subverting, destabilizing, or even destroying the core of the Christian faith. Both this process of destabilization, you can hear order and chaos in here, can't you? Destabilization and the identification of its threats may be spread out over an extended period of time. A way of making sense of one aspect of the Christian faith, such as the identity of Jesus of Nazareth, an aspect that may initially be welcomed and find a general acceptance, may later have to be discontinued on account of the potential damage it is subsequently realized to be capable of causing. So, in other words, you add things into the story, and over, could be hundreds or even thousands of years, you begin to realize that doesn't cohere. And you see elements of this in C.S. Lewis's Miracles, where he talks about the grand miracle as the piece that fits into the center of the story. We knew other pieces of the story, and then when we see that piece, we say, it fits. Remember? We're pattern seeking. Say, the patterns are nicely. Do we know what it means that they're nicely? Not really, but but we have a sense of it. And so this is the process we're always undergoing. And in fact, orthodoxy and heresy always grow up together, because you don't have, for example, the doctrine of Christ until you have all of these ideas on the table, and then you watch them all being worked out, and you discover this is the one that works. Well, what do you mean by works? It produces the stable, cohesive, flourishing system that is this ultimate story, that is Christianity, that is the religion. Now, there's always two simultaneous threads. There's change. We think about it in terms of progress or sometimes corruption. And some things displace the others through a sort of competition or winning or losing. But you don't have change without same. They're both there together, because there's no change without sameness. Otherwise, you've just got a series of disconnected snapshots, just like in the movie Memento. So there's change and there's same, and they're always working right there together with each other. So the two core questions I had: what is my or our problem? That's a process, and you're asking the question: what is perdition? What is loss? What is death? What is losing? What is lostness? And then what is the solution? Because we're always sensing the lostness. Well, what is the solution? Well, it's a process too, and that's salvation. Well, what is salvation? And you'll hear me when I do my conversations with people, people will say saved, and I'll immediately stop them, usually, because I'm a rude New Jersey person who interrupts people, and I'll say, what do you mean by saved? And usually they kind of stop, because they realize they always use that word, and they realize they've always had a religion in the back of their minds, but seldom do people bring it up front. Well, you might ask, well, what's the job of a pastor? Well, the job of a pastor is to help you bring your religion up front. And then as a Christian pastor, I'm going to say, okay, here's the elements of your religion. Here's the Christian religion. You might want to do some compare and contrast there, because this Christian religion has been around for thousands of years, and they've worked out a whole lot of things. It's not some crippled ideology. They've worked out a whole lot of things, and you're going to want to test your own little personal religion that you've been creating. Now, it might be your little special thing, and you think it's wonderful. Well, that's great. But you might want to compare it to the others, because the truth is you'll probably learn something, because a whole lot of really smart people have lived lives in a whole lot of contexts and have had a whole lot of suffering and a whole lot of joy and a whole lot of wisdom. And this little thing that you're developing in you, this soul, could be fed by the far bigger elements. And so really, I'm going to up the resolution in the story hierarchy. What is our problem gets built into what am I, or why am I here? Existential mind, purpose. And then the other, what is the solution? Where are we going? So what am I? And immediately you see options, but some of these options are more dead-endish than others. The first definition, the complex product of mindless nature. Okay, and I was listening to Will Durant's the Story of Philosophy, and one of the, I'm always wrestling with certain definitions, so I'll probably do a word that fudge of nature at some point. But nature seems to be that which it's natural, and my best understanding of it is that which is not the product of mind. That seems to be our definition. It's the product of patterns that will hasn't, at least this is again within a secular framework, that will hasn't tinkered with. And this is part of my problem with the term supernatural, because I would assert, in terms of the Christian story, you might ask, well, what parts of Middle Earth have Tolkien, are not products of Tolkien's mind? That's actually a very complicated question, but it illuminates the complexity of this word nature. So, see, this physicalism, I'm going to have to talk to Vervaeke about that, because I think he lets in God. But this materialist, there's mindless nature. And again, I think we've been motivated to kick God out because we don't want him there, because he's emotionally troublesome for us. There's a history of Western secularity right there. Another person might say a spiritual being having a material experience. You hear that often from more pantheistic circles. It's kind of a Gnostic-ish Eastern answer. And 3 Christian answers. Breath of God, stuff of earth, from Genesis 2. An embodied story, a living nephesh, Genesis 2. Image bearer of God, Genesis 1. And so you have these competing questions of what am I? And depending on how you answer this question, there will be consequences in terms of your story verse that develop. And again, going back to Paul Maxwell's History of Philosophy, you have metaphysics, that which is beneath it all, that which makes up everything. The ancients started there. You have epistemology, how or what we can know. The moderns tend to start there. Axiology, what we ought to do, and postmoderns start there. Now, I think there are consequences for starting with epistemology or even axiology, and the consequences are you're probably going to have snuck in a metaphysic. Or if you're starting with axiology, you're going to have snuck in an epistemology. I think we're seeing that with the breakdown of critical theory. So if we leave the underlying foundational elements unattended, well, you're probably just going to be smuggling stuff in. And worldviews have limitations. And today, actually I wasn't going to post this one today, but I posted my conversations with Dr. James because I thought it was such a good conversation. And he makes the point that snuck into a lot of the celebrity atheist stuff was in fact an eschatology, was a vision for the good life. But the metaphysic was snuck in beneath it. The metaphysic of physicalism is that it's dependent upon the known physical universe. And so if you're going to sneak in the laws of physics without saying where they come from, or that they're eternal, or that, as Rupert Sheldrake notes, they apply to every universe, well, you're kind of barking up the tree of a lot of God number one. You have this implicit eschatology as limited to the laws of physics, which means that, well, when you die, you die. And that's a function of the religion. That's a function of the worldview. And that's why I like to push religion past, well, just the rites and ceremonies, and go beneath what the rites and ceremonies in that sacramental way are trying to connect us to. Because there's a metaphysic down below. And you'll bump into these limits throughout an analysis of a particular worldview or particular religious presuppositions that people are maintaining. So another question, why am I here? Well, materialists will say there is no reason you're here. No formal or final cause. Purpose in this case is an illusion. What's the meaning of life? It's a bad question. There is no meaning. There can't be, because there's no mind to give it purpose. There is a mind, here's another answer, there is a mind with intention that planned for you individually or collectively, and had a reason for your existence, had a mission for you, had a role for you, and people feel this, and people like feeling this, and when people don't feel this, they get nihilistic and they have a meaning crisis. And then one of my favorite Christian ones, why am I here? You're here for glory. That's dependent upon a seer and an enjoyer and a judger. But you're here for glory. The world was made for glory. What is our problem? Well, there's lots of answers given by religion over history. There's suffering. And I was fascinated. I'm going to probably keep coming back to Vervaeke's analysis of the first noble truth of dukkha as really decay, which is actually quite close to my own theological system in terms of how my reading of the Old and New Testament. So there's something for my conversation with John Vervaeke when that finally happens. Death, decay, rebellion against our maker, despair, and some of these are emotional. And that's very interesting. They're of the psyche, and therefore we have psychologists and psychiatrists that try to give us health and wellness. Limitation. Are we going to become unlimited? Well, how could we? Well, it depends a lot on the framework, on the religious presuppositions of the story that you're looking. What is our problem? Evil. And Jordan Peterson mentions, well, he in trying to help people get through their issues, he has to bring evil into the story and have them wrestle with evil. Disconnection from our source, failing to realize we are part of the one. All these different religious ideas out there. Hate has become the substitution for sin now in the contemporary frame. What is the solution? My answers really start to proliferate. Trust, obedience, fixing ourselves, fixing the world, fixing the problem, fixing every problem. Love. They just come through. Where are we going? Well, lots of problems. You get opposite answers. Place of no suffering. Is it a place or is it a time? Or is it a place and a time? No suffering, no decay, no loss, no death, no injustice. Limitations in the what we are question then force limitations here. And so with different worldviews, you will afford things like life after death, or a place where the hopes and dreams, our present hopes and dreams are realized, or a place where the injustices are dealt with. And so this develops all the way through. But you can see where you start with these two questions and very quickly outdevelop the hierarchies. And as Peterson says, people default to theological language. And as the philosopher, he made the same point. We don't have another language that we can use. And then the question is, well, why are you so bashful about the old one? It's the most tested. It's the most common. There's something to these archetypal observations. There's a reason why the best movies tell the old stories. And the old Walt Disney knew that. The new ones, they don't seem to know that so much. And that shows the change in culture. We have this culture of authenticity that imagines that I myself am a deep well out of which can come everything we need, instead of realizing that, well, it's such an amazing move to make. It actually makes perfect sense in a culture that says that I live within this iron box. Now I'm going to imagine, so I'm going to cheat on the bottom because I'm keeping a hard surface at the top. Why? Because I really don't want to imagine that there is a mind that will judge me, or to whom I am responsible, or that this world is somehow dependent upon. If I discover that I'm living in a simulation, I'll be ticked. Well, your experience of anger and disappointment will be part of that simulation too. This is why you never get away from the religious. It's always at the bottom. You can't get outside of it, as Peterson always says about the archetypal. It's why all life connects to the religious layer. It's why when you sit down and talk to someone and they're experiencing deep anguish and trouble, you will get all the way down to the religious. That's where it will wind up. Why? Because this is what the language was developed for. And in many ways, the best stories win, I would hope. That's what we hope for. And they had in the objectivist conversation this thing about truth, yeah, but not just propositional truth, all of the aspects of truth, all of the members of the family. Ontological argument, it's very interesting when you apply the ontological argument to other things in the world. So the ontological argument as applied to the storyverse. The best story we can conceive of is often limited to our ability to not only imagine, but to also believe. And I think many people are bumping into this. They're sensing a better story, and they want to believe it, but beliefs aren't subject to volition. So actually they come. And if, again, you listen to Tim Keller, who's a very adept Christian evangelist, one of the things that he says in his considerable experience with listening to people convert is that they have to first want to. Not always. C.S. Lewis calls himself the most reluctant convert, and sometimes people convert kicking and screaming. But often they want to, and in time the feelings catch up with everything else, because you're not in charge of your beliefs. In many ways, your beliefs are sort of like your feelings, but they're also different. So the best story we can conceive of is often limited by our ability to not only imagine, but also to believe. And this is the heart of the meaning crisis. We believe too little. This is where you get C.S. Lewis's beginning of his great sermon, The Weight of Glory, which if you've never read it, you can find it on the internet for free. If you ask 20 good men today what they thought the highest virtues, 19 of them would reply unselfishness. But if you had asked almost any of the great Christians of old, he would have replied love. You see what has happened? A negative term has been substituted for a positive. And I'd say, why? And I'd say, because of what we've done in throwing away all of the language that now we're discovering we need. I'll continue reading. You see what happened? A negative term has been substituted for a positive. And this is more than philological importance. The negative idea of unselfishness carries with it the suggestion not primarily of securing good things for others, but of going without them ourselves, as if our abstinence and not their happiness was the important point. I do not think that this is the Christian virtue of love. The New Testament has lots to say about self-denial, but not about self-denial as an end in itself. We are told to deny ourselves and to take up our crosses in order that we may follow Christ. And nearly every description of what we shall ultimately find, if we do so, contains an appeal to desire. If there lurks in the modern minds the notion that to desire our own good and earnestly to hope for the enjoyment of it is a bad thing, I suspect this notion has crept in from Kant and the Stoics and is no part of the Christian faith. Indeed, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward, and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an infinite child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. As a parent, I've been there often. You have your little kid and they're sitting there doing something and, do you want to go out for ice cream? No, I want to play with my truck. Okay. No, you really want to go on vacation with us. You really do. No, I don't want to. And sometimes our Heavenly Father grabs us and says, you're going on vacation because I love you and it's for your good. Maybe you'll cry in the car. Maybe you'll kick against the car seat. But Christianity is a very optimistic religion where our Heavenly Father sometimes takes us, puts us in the car seat and says, you're coming with me and you're going to love it. So words that fudge, religion, very fudgy word, very important word to get a handle on.